Timelines are supposed to bring clarity. They take chaos and force it into order, minute by minute, event by event. When something happens, the timeline tells us where it belongs and why it matters. That's why timelines feel trustworthy. They look objective, mechanical, immune to interpretation. But this case depends on a timeline that only makes sense if you ignore one specific hour. At first, nothing looks wrong. The sequence appears clean. Events flow logically. One action leads to another. Reports reference precise times. Everything seems anchored. And that's what makes this so effective. The problem isn't that the timeline is sloppy. It's that it's selective, buried. Inside the file is a gap, not a missing page, not a redacted section. Just an hour that quietly disappears between the timestamps that are never questioned. The timeline jumps forward, and the jump is treated as normal. No explanation is given. No justification offered. The or simply isn't there. Most people won't notice this on a first read. The structure encourages you not to. Your attention is guided toward what's included, not what's missing. When a timeline looks detailed, we assume completeness. We don't stop to count the minutes. We trust the flow. But timelines don't skip time accidentally. When an hour vanishes, it means one of two things. Either nothing happened, or what happened didn't fit. And in this case, nothing happened isn't supported anywhere in the record. There's no statement that the period was uneventful, no confirmation that activity stopped. The hour is simply removed from consideration. What makes this more unsettling is that events on both sides of the gap are treated as causally connected. Something happens before, something happens after, and the investigation draws a straight line between them, as if the missing hour had no influence, as if time itself paused. This creates a fragile illusion. The conclusion depends on continuity, but continuity is assumed rather than demonstrated. The timeline works only because the gap is never acknowledged. The moment you notice it, everything that follows becomes unstable inside the file. There are references to actions that would have required time, movement, decisions, changes in position. Yet all of those are compressed into the space around the gap. The missing hour becomes a kind of buffer zone where things must have happened, but aren't allowed to be examined. There's a subtle language shift that helps this omission go unnoticed. Phrases like later that evening or shortly after replace exact times. These phrases feel precise, but they're not. They blur boundaries. They make it easier for an hour to disappear without raising alarms. At no point does the investigation ask the most basic question. What happened during that hour? Not what probably happened, but what can be shown to have happened. The absence of the question is the key, because asking it would force the timeline to confront its own fragility. This is where timelines stop being tools and start being arguments. Instead of mapping reality, they begin to defend conclusions. Every included timestamp supports the story. Every excluded minute threatens it. And so exclusion becomes a strategy, even if no one ever calls it that. As the case progresses, the missing hour becomes structurally irrelevant. Other evidence is interpreted as if the gap doesn't exist. Statements are aligned. Reports are written. Each new document references the same truncated sequence. Repetition creates legitimacy. The gap fades further into the background. What's especially dangerous about this is how normal it feels. Timelines are often incomplete. No one expects every second to be accounted for. But there is a difference between general uncertainty and a precise, unexamined void. This or isn't vague. It's specific. And specificity without explanation should always raise concern. By the time the case reaches its critical stages, the timeline is no longer questioned. It's cited, used as a foundation, treated as fact, and because it appears internally consistent, few people feel the need to challenge it. Consistency becomes a substitute for completeness. At this point, the conclusion hasn't been finalized yet, but like the cases before it, the shape of the outcome is already visible. The timeline has done its work. It has removed complexity by removing time. And the longer the case moves forward, the harder it becomes to reinsert what was taken out. Because reintroducing that R would mean reopening assumptions. It would mean admitting that the neat sequence everyone relied on was missing something essential. And once people build confidence on a timeline, they resist anything that threatens it. That missing R isn't just empty space. It's where the timeline is most vulnerable. And it's where the truth, if it exists, would have the most room to appear. And that's exactly why it was never examined, containing the case. The missing R began to exert an almost gravitational pull on every detail. Any new piece of evidence, any witness statement, was subconsciously interpreted through the lens of the truncated timeline. Actions that might have seemed contradictory, movements that could have contradicted the official story, were quietly adjusted or overlooked. The gap acted like a shadow over the entire investigation, shaping perceptions without being explicitly addressed. It was there, everywhere, yet nowhere at all. Analysts reviewing the file noticed small anomalies that hinted at the hour's existence. A key witness reported being somewhere during the period in question. A movement of objects in a room wasn't accounted for, and subtle changes in communications logs didn't align with the timestamps. But these fragments were treated as minor, almost incidental. The narrative had already been structured around the assumption that the hour didn't exist. Any conflicting evidence was reconciled to fit, rather than used to question the structure. The missing R had become a kind of invisible law, governing the interpretation of every fact. What's particularly unsettling is how deliberate this invisibility seems in retrospect. There's no indication that anyone forgot to ask the critical question. On the contrary, the omission functions as if it were intentional. The timeline itself, meticulously detailed elsewhere, signals competence, thoroughness, and credibility. But in one carefully excised segment, it masks a vulnerability that undercuts all certainty. The more precise the rest of the timeline appears, the more glaring the absence becomes. In essence, it's a trap of perception. The audience, and even the investigators, are lulled into trust by the very order surrounding the gap. As the investigation progressed, the consequences of ignoring that R became apparent. Decisions were made, people were questioned, and strategies were developed based on the illusion of continuity. Nothing within the truncated timeline suggested that anything had gone wrong, or that critical events had occurred. But the missing R could have contained exactly that, the turning point, the action that set everything else in motion. The pivotal moment everyone had assumed was already accounted for elsewhere. Every subsequent step of the case relied on an assumption, a blank space masquerading as certainty. The detective teams knew they were navigating a precarious situation. Every attempt to interrogate the sequence of events was constrained by the established timeline. The missing R had become institutionalized. Reports cited it indirectly. Witness statements were interpreted through the frame of what came before and after the gap. Any suggestion that something could have happened during that hour was quietly minimized, dismissed, or rationalized. It's a phenomenon that happens often in investigations. Once a structure is in place, anomalies are forced to fit rather than reshaping the framework itself. Yet even as the investigators worked within these confines, there were hints that the missing R contained critical information. Phone calls that were logged but unexamined, movements of key individuals that were compressed into vague references, and items that appeared or disappeared without explanation all suggested that someone had acted, or something had occurred, during that precise period. But since the timeline didn't officially recognize it, these anomalies were treated as secondary rather than central. They became faint whispers, evidence of activity that was simultaneously present and denied. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Confidence in the timeline encourages trust in its conclusions. Trust in the conclusions discourages critical questioning. By the time doubts arise, they are weighed against an established narrative that appears internally consistent. The missing R is no longer seen as an oversight. It becomes invisible, a structural assumption embedded into every decision, every analysis, every report. Those who might have challenged it hesitate, because to question the timeline is to question the foundation of all prior work. And in high-stakes investigations, questioning foundations is often discouraged, consciously or unconsciously. The implications of this are profound. That 1 hour seemingly innocuous, officially non-existent could hold the key to motive, opportunity, or sequence of events. It could reveal inconsistencies, expose false assumptions, or highlight deliberate manipulation. But because it is excluded, all other conclusions are provisional, fragile, dependent on the very absence that makes them appear stable. The illusion of order created by the timeline is, in truth, a veneer, a thin layer covering uncertainty. And yet, despite this vulnerability, the case moved forward. Decisions were executed, conclusions drawn, and actions taken, all built on the structure that ignored the missing hour. Reports were finalized, statements were published, and the official record presented a seamless sequence of events. The narrative became self-reinforcing. The timeline appeared complete precisely because the hour wasn't examined. And because it wasn't examined, the narrative gained legitimacy. It's a mechanism of perception as much as procedure. Omission becomes authority. In the end, the missing hour stands as both a warning and a revelation. It reminds us the timelines, for all their precision, are only as reliable as the moments they include, and dangerously unreliable when they exclude. The unexamined hour is where reality, if it were truly considered, could overturn everything, and it is for the reason because it threatens conclusions, disrupts order, and challenges authority that it was never asked, never analyzed, and ultimately, never acknowledged. The timeline works perfectly only if you pretend it doesn't exist, and that, in itself, is the most important truth of all.